Okay, hi everybody. The Bradford seminar speaker today is Simon Donner. Simon is a professor at the University of British Columbia in the Department of Geography and the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries. He received degrees from McMaster and Duke universities before completing his PhD in Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences at the University of Wisconsin. So much for the formal stuff. I've been lucky to find a succession of very bright graduate students and postdocs who helped me launch and continue my career here. And Simon was the very first. He was my postdoc the first year that I got here, and the cornerstone of my early career. Once here, he began to publish a wide range of research, including some of the first quantification of the local fate of coral reefs in overwhelming the world, the relation of diet to nutrient and carbon flows, and how people understand the climate impact of their individual actions. A very, very wide range of interests. Simon's self-description on his personal website is really as clear in a direct sense of, it gives as clear in a direct sense of the person as I can, so I'm just going to quote him. I'm a climate scientist and a professor at the University of British Columbia focused on helping the world prevent and prepare for climate change. In other words, Simon is a research scientist, an educator, and a policy activist. Working as he often does in the Pacific Islands that were once colonies, Simon is also especially attentive to the questions of fairness, equity, and representation that we are all concentrating on these days, and it should arise for all scientists in the conduct of their work, no matter where it takes place. Simon's topic today is Getting to Net Zero, a Canadian Perspective, about his experiences advising the Canadian government on climate policy. Please join me in welcoming Simon Paxton.
Thanks. First of all, thanks, Michael, for the wonderful introduction. It's been a long time since I was first working here. I've been back to visit a couple times, but I'm pretty far away in British Columbia, so I don't get to be here much, and it's a real treat to come back and see some familiar faces and see the great spread that Chuck always puts out for these seminars, which was true 18 years ago as it is today. So I'm going to talk to you today about not about my research. I'm going to talk to you today about work I've been involved in for the past few years with the Canadian government. And for some perspective on sort of how this happened, I'm going to first just talk a little bit about, give you a little background on sort of where Canada is on climate change, how people, broad sense, feel about climate change. Before I do that, I did want to say one thing. I am at the University of British Columbia, and it is standard in Canada, but particularly in British Columbia, to always do a land acknowledgement before doing any sort of public event or seminar. And so the University of British Columbia is out on a point in Vancouver, and that point on the west side of Vancouver is part of Musqueam territory. And so the Musqueam First Nation, it is ancestral and traditional lands. But what's unique about British Columbia is it's also unceded land. And so unlike a lot of North America, there actually are no treaties. And so when people talk about being on stolen land, I mean, there really isn't even an agreement. Whether those agreements were signed in good faith is another story, but there is like nothing at all. And I bring that up not only because it's important to recognize, but also because it's really important with the challenge we're talking about today. Because getting to net zero in Canada in particular, but I think also in the United States, is really also about reconciling with the wrongs of the past, particularly about the wrongs done to First Nations and Indigenous peoples in Canada. Not only to sort of build a better future, but because realistically, we're talking about building a lot of things, and we're talking about building them on land that does not necessarily belong to the people, or at least initially belong to the people who are talking about building everything. And that's one of the biggest struggles that, frankly, the Canadian government has right now. So, but just to give a little bit of background, oop, wrong thing.
Oh, that's it?
I got the lapel one, so let me see if we can do that. Okay, I'll skip over that. So Canadians, as I think people probably have a sense, are generally on most questions about climate change slightly further along than Americans, but there are divides across the country. And this is from data that's led by Mal Mildenberger, surveys that are done similar to the US. So it's the same questions that you can see for the US, but actually done by ridings, which are basically our political districts in Canada. You'll notice many of the districts are very large because there's very small populations in northern parts of Canada. And you'll see that across the country, the majority of Canadians feel like they're already experiencing negative effects of climate change. The national number here, and this is 2018 data, was 70%. And you'll see it's much higher in some parts of the country, particularly in Quebec. And you can't really see the major cities, Vancouver, Toronto, Calgary, Montreal, et cetera, because the ridings are so small, so it's hard to see on a global map, but the numbers are very high in most of the cities. This was done in 2018, and just as people in the United States have experienced, we have experienced an incredible array of extreme events over the past few years that have been very deadly. And I'm just going to point to what happened, particularly in British Columbia over the past year, because I think it made worldwide news, worldwide attention. And for anyone like myself that always thought you had to, when I was younger, particularly when I was a postdoc here, that you have to go somewhere else to really see the effects of climate change, it was very clear that climate change was right outside our door. So this was June 2021 in British Columbia. These numbers are all in Celsius, just to be clear. So 49.6 degrees Celsius in Lytton is the national record. That's the warmest temperature ever recorded in the country. It broke the record by a couple degrees Celsius, and that is 122 degrees Fahrenheit. So we had this incredible heat wave. In Vancouver, temperatures were like 32, 33 degrees Celsius, so around 90. Doesn't sound hot, but we have a temperate climate right along the coast. People are not adjusted to heat like that. People do not have air conditioning, and almost 700 people died as a result of the heat wave, right? And this is in the wealthiest city in Canada, right? Just to get a sense of the impacts and the inequality of who was it that died, people who live on the street, people who live in long-term care, et cetera. So there's a real inequality to the loss, to the mortality. Now, of course, it was dry, it was hot, fires happened. That town of Lytton, where the national temperature record was set, this is what Lytton looked like 2 days later. The town of Lytton no longer has anyone living in it. It was completely, every building was burned, and there's now sort of work to figure out how do we reconstruct. Right, so just to give you a sense. That was June, so this is June 2021. We had a dry summer, we had forest fires, soils were loose, and then we had heavy rainfall in the fall. Now, we get a lot of rain on the west coast of Canada, just like you do in the Pacific Northwest in the US. This was particularly intense, a series of atmospheric rivers in a row, and we had this intense flooding event in November. That's the Trans-Canada Highway that goes across the country, just a little bit east of Vancouver. The flooding was so bad, partly because of land use decisions over the years, but also just because the slopes of the mountains were very loose in a lot of places where there had been fires and whatnot, so there were a lot of landslides, people were killed. And just to give you a sense of it, the rail lines and the train lines that all come into Vancouver, come towards the west coast into Vancouver, at one point for about a week, were all broken somewhere. So there was no way from Vancouver to get to the rest of the country unless you were traveling by air or you went through the United States. Just to give you a sense of the severity of this, the human toll was much, much smaller from this event, but the rebuilding is going to take years. There's a lot of revisioning to do. It's incredibly complicated. I still am amazed that they were, if you see some of the damage for the Trans-Canada Highway, I'm amazed they were able to rebuild it as fast as they did. And just to add to this a little bit, Vancouver's on the coast, and in early January, during the astronomical high tides, well, the astronomical high tides coincided with a storm, helped a little bit by sea level rise, and so we had some coastal flooding around town. Not a lot of damage to infrastructure. A few large piers and docks were damaged, but this barge, which is usually, it has cement in it, it's usually parked out in the middle, in the middle of the bay, tied to a buoy. I know it very well because I'm a paddler and I always go out and paddle around it. Well, it broke off the mooring. No one could stop it because of the power of the winds and the very high tide. Got wedged onto the downtown shore, and it is still sitting there because no one can remove it. So the only choice is to actually dismantle it. And so they're slowly dismantling this barge that is sitting on the downtown shore. The park board put up a sign next to it. It's got a sign that's called Barge Chilling Park, which is a bit of a local joke based on the name of another park. And it's just to point out that the impacts of climate change are dangerous. They are also very unexpected. This is not something anyone would predict, but it's clearly an impact of, of climate change. So Canada is definitely feeling the effects of climate change. Canadians across the country, even folks that are that would fall on the sort of dubious or skeptical side, are definitely aware of the impacts that are happening. Yet Canada is behind, particularly compared to the other G7 nations, in reducing emissions. We are the only G7 nation where emissions have not gone down since 2005. They've been relatively level. And if I were the Prime Minister, I would tell you a bunch of reasons why, which somebody watching from the outside would sound like they're making excuses, but actually are reasonable arguments. The first is that Canada's a very large country with a small population, 37 million people, spread out, which means transportation takes a lot of fuel, right? So step one. Second, it is cold. That's not a picture of me, but I have cycled in conditions like that a lot back when I grew up in Ontario. So it takes a lot of energy to heat, right? We have a lot of oil and gas resources, and that is oil in particular is a big part of the Canadian economy and has been for a long time. And it's regionally divided. It's not spread out evenly across the country, which means problem number 4 in the corner. We have a very federalist system where the provinces control all the resources and the federal government doesn't have a ton of control over everything, which makes it difficult, if the resources are not evenly divided across the country, to say, well, we want to ramp down oil production. Well, that's basically telling one province what to do, right? So it's actually a very difficult challenge in Canada. So just to give you a sense of it, here's a historical data on greenhouse gas emissions. You can see in the black line, the dip at the end that's the 2020 data. So that's because of the pandemic, it's hard to know what to make of it. And I'm showing you the targets that Canada set, the original targets set by the previous Conservative government, but then adopted by the current Trudeau government. From Paris was a 30% reduction below 2005 levels. And then last year, they increased it to a 40 to 45% reduction that was presented at the Glasgow Climate Conference. And as you can see, that's a pretty sharp decline from where we are today, right? And so the government has a whole number of plans and policies, a lot of policies that have been implemented, some that are being discussed about how they're going to be implemented, but this is going to be a big challenge. And if you add up everything that's been on the books so far, it's, even the most optimistic assumptions get maybe 36%, but that's the absolute most optimistic assumption I've seen. So it's going to be a challenge. Give you just a little bit of background. Where are these emissions coming from? The two largest sectors, oil and gas and transportation. And it's important here to note that when the way emissions accounting is done is these are emissions that come from within Canada's borders. So this is not the oil and gas means these are emissions from producing and extracting oil and producing and extracting gas, and a little bit from transporting it within the country. But if that oil is exported and burned in another country, it's on their balance sheet, not on Canada's. Which means that there's the concept of, well, if we could get oil production emissions down to 0, then you could keep producing oil and selling it elsewhere because it wouldn't be on Canada's balance sheet, right? Which is something that is a very difficult, obviously you can imagine, economic and political discussion in the country. But also to note, transportation is very close behind oil and gas. I'll say this is the 2019 data. In the 2020 data, oil and gas is even higher. It's 27%. Transportation went down. But it's hard to say how much that's mostly because of the pandemic. So I'm a little wary of showing you that. The other thing you'll notice is electricity is small, 8%. Canada has a very low carbon electricity sector. And so since 2005, electricity has actually dropped in half. It was already low carbon. It's gotten even lower carbon. Most of that decline is because the province of Ontario closed its coal-burning power plants. But you'll see the two sectors where there's been an increase has been oil and gas and transportation. Everything else has been flat or has been declining. So the electricity generation in Canada, our relatively low carbon grid presents a potential pathway to decarbonization. The challenge again being provincial boundaries and everything, expansion and interconnection. Each province manages its own electricity grid. In some cases, the organization managing it is a crown corporation, which is sadly still the terminology you use in Canada for companies that are created by the government. In some cases, they're private. And they do not necessarily work together well. They have different regulatory systems. So interties are really hard to do, right? And we recognize that, getting to net zero may require a doubling of the grid because of the increased electricity demand for vehicles and for heating. So it's going to be hard. But there is potential. 60% of power is hydroelectric. Uranium basically just means nuclear. And so we're really less than 20% is coming from fossil fuels right now. Again, this is spread across the country. My province of British Columbia is more or less 100% hydro. Manitoba is more or less 100% hydro. The coal is basically Alberta, Saskatchewan, and a little bit on the East Coast, right? So it's very regional problem. Now, when we talk about oil in Canada, this is what everyone thinks about, the oil sands in Alberta. Michael's going to smile. Canadians say oil sands. Other people often say tar sands. Basically what happened is tar sands is the word that everyone locally used for years, and then the oil companies said oil sands sounds better because it makes it sound like oil, and pushed, and somehow we've all adopted saying oil sands, even though like people who work there say tar sands. So if you're like working on one of the trucks, people tend to say tar sands because what's being pulled out of the ground looks like tar and it's being processed to extract the bitumen, which can be made into oil, right? So this enormous development is the real driver of that increase in oil and gas emissions in Canada. So 80% of oil production, a little over 80%, comes from Alberta, but it's not the only place we have offshore oil production off Newfoundland and Labrador. The government actually just approved a new project there. And there's some in Saskatchewan as well. That is not all oil sands. There is a lot of conventional oil as well. What's going on, and the reason you hear about the oil sands all the time, is because it takes so much energy to extract it. There's a lot of emissions generated from extracting oil, but also because it's been increasing, right? Just like shale in the United States. And so if we look at the oil and gas emissions in Canada and break it down by categories, if you look at the blue there, and forget the 2020 data at the end, the oil sands has been expanding over time. And so if you go and break down to subsectors within Canadian greenhouse gas reporting, the oil sands is really the one thing that's been driving emissions growth, with a little bit of heavy-duty transportation as well, right? So it used to be 1990, I think it was 3%. 2019, it's up to 12% of Canadian emissions, right? And so although it's still a small fraction, that's why it gets so much attention from people, right? Because it is growing while other sectors have at least are declining or seem to have more potential for emissions decline. So if you excluded the oil sands from Canada's national budget, which obviously would be unfair, but just if you did, emissions have dropped since 2005. And so this is the argument that sometimes you'll hear from someone in the federal government, is to say we are actually taking actions to reduce emissions. You just can't see it if you look at the total, because oil and gas is harder to deal with. And so because of this, we have this regional divide where some provinces are very disproportionately responsible for the emissions in Canada. The per capita emissions in Alberta and Saskatchewan is the SK there, are 5 to 6 times that of Ontario, BC, and Quebec, which are the highest provinces with the highest populations. But because the provinces are in charge of resources, management and policy around this can be really challenging. So in 2015, I think everyone probably recognizes our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who's quite famous. In 2015, when Justin Trudeau came into power, one of the staples of their argument was that we can have both. We can have both the environment and the economy, which was a way of saying we can still have an oil industry, but we can also reduce emissions at the same time. And the argument for achieving that was, we're going to put a price on pollution. We're going to put in a carbon price. Adopting, basically making a federal version of a policy that already existed in British Columbia. At the same time, fights about how Alberta can get oil to market were continuing, and the federal government rejected several pipeline proposals, but approved one that goes from Alberta to Vancouver, and it is an expansion of existing pipelines. The line, the right-of-way already exists, there's already a pipe on it, and then you're just putting another pipe next to it. So in terms of siting, local pressures and everything, if you were going to build a pipeline, it would be the way to do it. However, it is another way to export oil, which means potential for increased capacity and production in the oil sands, and so it's been the site of a really big political debate. And so although our current government is the most progressive you could find on climate change in Canada's history and is doing a lot of real things, they also approved a pipeline, and then when the company started to have financial trouble, bought it. So the federal government bought this expanded Trans Mountain pipeline, which is why you see this, the man in the kind of army-colored sweater holding the jacket, holding the end of the poster there is the mayor of Vancouver, and next to him is Elizabeth May, who was the former head of the Green Party of Canada and was a member of Parliament. Right? And so these debates are going to continue for a long time because the problems are hard and because there's real provincial differences. BC's in the way of Alberta being able to export oil. Right? And the city of Vancouver and the surrounding municipalities were all against the pipeline. And they're saying, well, it comes through our territory, we should have some say. As were most of the First Nations, but not all, on the pipeline route. So these battles continue. Same is true on carbon pricing. The support for carbon pricing across Canada this is 2018, but the data is more or less the same now. It's 54% on average across the country. So the majority of people are in favor of carbon pricing, but it is tight, and you can definitely see Alberta and Saskatchewan is definitely not majority in support, but there is pockets of support actually within some of the cities, particularly in Edmonton. And although the carbon price had been in place, many of the premiers of the individual provinces were against it. And the way the carbon price was created at the beginning was they said, we're creating a federal pricing system. We're not going to force you to take it. You can create your own system, but it's got to have a whole bunch of minimum benchmarks. And if you pass all those benchmarks, the government won't enforce its own. So it was kind of a way to negotiate with the provinces. But even that, a number of the provincial premiers fought it. They lost their case in court. The Supreme Court clearly ruled that the federal government has the right to do this. It was a constitutional challenge. And one of the interesting things about that argument was that the federal government, the court basically argued that it's not really a price, it's a regulation, because they're just saying you have to do something. We're not telling you have to use our price, which was interesting. However, Alberta has a new premier that is very far to the right and quite reactionary is probably a polite word to use, and claims that they're going to challenge the carbon tax again in court. Nobody thinks there's much point to this because the law is pretty clear, but this may happen again. So where we were leading in about 2019 was we had this carbon price, and that's what Canada's most famous for in climate policy. Revenues are recycled, so 70% of the country gets more money back than they pay, and then the other 30% are very high income people, the way the system works. You know, as I mentioned, each province can develop its own system as long as it meets some standards. There's also an output-based, that should say, system for trade exposed and energy intensive industries. So if there's a threat that, you know, having to pay the extra cost in Canada means you're just going to move your operation overseas, they have a different system for anyone, all businesses, sort of with those pressures. The thing that one does not hear it outside the country is there's a whole suite of other regulations, investment programs, and everything due to climate change. But the carbon price, for obvious reasons, gets so much attention. And what was interesting is a couple years ago, the government said, okay, we only had a plan to 2022. It was going up to $50 a ton by 2022, but they now have a plan. It's supposed to go to $170 per ton by 2030, so going up about $15 a year. And what's fascinating about that is that comes straight out of modeling work done by folks, Canadian equivalents of Jesse Jenkins in a way, right, that said this is what we think the value needs to be to help meet some of your targets, right? So really was, in a way, something that's quite Canadian, you know, sort of listening to expertise and trying to put things into policy, but taking years to do it, which is sort of the Canadian way because we over-consult, basically. And so then there was an election in 2019, and leading up to the election, the Prime Minister said, we're going to make the climate targets for the country legally binding. They're going to put them in legislation rather than just something we say. And they came into power, and they passed this act, the Net Zero Accountability Act, and the dates are a bit confusing because the way Canadian law works, it takes a long time for something to get official royal assent. But this was proposed just after the election in 2019. And so in December of 2019, and then in this act, it said we're going to create an advisory body called the Net Zero Advisory Body that's going to give the federal government advice on what the target should be and other things that the minister asks of it. And this is a concept borrowed from other countries. The UK, New Zealand, France, Costa Rica, et cetera, have these arm's length advisory bodies that give the government advice on climate policy. And so one morning in December, I checked my email, and there was an email from the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change Canada's office from a name that looked familiar, somebody I thought I'd met before, saying, could I give you a call later today? And I thought, oh God, what have I done? Because I've been vocal on some climate policy issues, and I just assumed that they were mad at me about something, and then it turned out they were asking me to be on the advisory body. So the advisory body had 14 inaugural members, and just to get a sense of it, you'll see my name there in the center. What you'll notice among all the members is I'm the only one where it says professor. There are other people here that are scientists. Almost everyone's highly educated. There are other scientists on the board, but I'm the only one that was asked to be there because I'm a climate scientist, right? So they didn't, and I think what was very smart about the design is they weren't looking for people to represent their own research. They were looking for people that could read things with arm's length. And so all the group are from real different walks of life. Kat Abreu was one of the best known climate activists in Canada, ran the Climate Action Network for many years. We have people from a regional chief that's a member of the Assembly of First Nations. Regional representation, it's Canada. You want to make sure you have an even representation of English and French, and the French shouldn't only be people from Quebec, right? So Gaetan Thomas from New Brunswick was there. And so it was an incredible group. Hassan Youssef, head of the Canadian Labour Congress, because we're thinking seriously about just transition for workers. Young Wu runs the Mars Discovery District in Toronto, which is like an accelerator innovation district in downtown Toronto. So it was an incredible group. Why they wanted me a part of it is a good question, because it's a really impressive group of people. And the idea behind it was more specific than the legislation. The legislation means that we have to exist. This advisory body needs to exist because it's in law, but there are terms of reference that the government wrote separately. And so our mandate is that we're supposed to be looking for the most likely pathways for Canada to achieve net zero emissions. Look at milestones leading up to 2050s, look at the building blocks, so make sure thinking long term, right? We have a 2030 target, but let's really be thinking long term. And what can we do to catalyze economic growth in that? But what's important here is, of course, our commitment is about how greenhouse gases are reported, right? So we're geographically bounded to emissions within Canada. So when we're talking about pathways to net zero emissions, Canada could, for example, as I said, be producing net zero oil in that the production of oil doesn't emit anything, but still be exporting it, and that wouldn't count. And that's not in our mandate exactly. However, and this is why I put a bold under most likely. This is what's interesting. We don't work on scope 3 emissions that are outside the country. However, we can consider what we think is most likely, right? And is it likely that if the world is moving toward net zero, there's going to be market for Canada's oil in the year 2050 and beyond? That is a very fair question. That is something we can talk about, right? So that's it. So just to give you a little bit of trickiness, what do we actually do? It's a very good question. Each year we have a series of lines of inquiry that we work on. We're not doing original research. That's not the idea. There are all sorts of research bodies around the country for that. We're basically integrating recommendations, right? We do, though, have a research budget, so if there's things that we think are missing, we can conduct or commission research if you can figure out a way to get it through the bureaucracy to do that. And then we're supposed to undertake robust engagement, which means that we bring in groups of people from across the country, from across sectors and everything, experts, people work in different sectors to tell us what they think. And then we work together to try to distill that into advice to the government. It means that we are, by terms of reference, the minister has to meet with us at least 3 times a year so we can share preliminary findings. Our work, our eventual work, maybe not all the deliberations, but all the eventual work is public, so we give advice to the minister. It goes to the minister first and then it becomes public, and they do have to respond. They don't have to respond to every sentence. They don't have to take every piece of our advice, nor should they. Nobody elected us, right? But they have to at least respond, which has been helpful. And when we're thinking about things, we need to consider not just reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This is in the terms of reference. Think about the economy, think about other environmental benefits, think about inclusivity, think about First Nations for sure, and think about technological readiness. It's just a lot to balance. So after we started, the first step, we were asked to write a short report with some initial observations on what does a pathway to net zero look like in Canada. And the way we frame this is we decided to look at what are sort of values and principles that we think are consistent in all of the research we heard from. So we surveyed a bunch of outside groups. Jesse Jenkins, Steve Pacala from Princeton that have worked on these sorts of questions were among the many people that came and spoke to us. And we put together these sets of like design principles and foundational values. And at the time, it seemed like a good project. And it's been more and more useful going on because we've had this as a way to frame everything we do. Right? And so anytime we're asked to give advice on something, we can just go by, well, what are the values we think are important and what are the principles we're working on? There are a bunch of these, and I'm not going to go over all of them, but I'm going to highlight a couple that have been, I'm finding the most valuable. The first one, and this comes straight out of folks that do net zero modeling and everything, is we're saying that we need to acknowledge in all decision making that there's actually a fair bit of certainty out there. Broad strokes, what passenger vehicles will look like. Energy, particularly in Canada, given the low carbon electricity grid, is going to be largely from heat pumps, electricity in cities, et cetera. There is certainty, broad strokes, and because of that, we can begin reverse engineering. If we need this by 2050, we're supposed to be taking the long view. We can start saying, well, you need to start this X now because we need to be at Y by 2050. And that's the advantage of being hands-off from the government advisory. We're able to step back and make those sort of arguments. The other principle that's been very helpful is the beware of dead ends. Don't build infrastructure that's going to get you a 10% reduction, but can't go beyond 10%. We're trying to eliminate emissions, right? And there's all sorts of examples I could point to in this, but one of them would simply be thinking about fossil fuel infrastructure, right? Unless we can show a way that this is only in only part of the necessary transition. This principle means, new fossil fuel infrastructure isn't going to make much sense, right? And so this has been useful in doing all of our advice. I'm going to skip the research part. So year one, we then had a series of lines of inquiry. We did not choose most of these. So the minister at the time said, I want you to work on these three things because they're largest emitting sectors: oil and gas, transportation, and buildings. We added one on our own, which we just called governance. And this was about institutional capacity within the government, but beyond government, and also just sort of about relationships, and I'll explain this a little bit. So we work on this, we'd hold roundtables, we consult with people, we had some outside groups help with the consultation, and then came up with a bunch of advice. And this advice, just because of timing, rather than going into an annual report, went towards this emissions reduction plan that the government in legislation had to release by 2022. And so this is reduction plan for 2030. And just to give you a sample, an idea of the type of advice we're giving, this isn't the line items of advice. There's about 20 pieces of very specific advice for each line of inquiry, but this is sort of the flavor of it. So we're arguing, okay, we need to make sure that we're not just reporting to the Minister of the Environment, right? That's our mandate, but we're saying you've got to make sure they're all talking to each other, right? And so we're making sure that every federal agency, and there are a lot of federal agencies within all of the ministries, and a lot of different crown corporations, they're all saying, how are we contributing to net zero emissions? What's our role? Make sure everyone in the civil service understands what this is about, which is not clear, right, outside of the Ministry of the Environment. And then the one that we're still working on now is making sure that all the modeling and analysis that is done on how far we are on the way, what progress we've made, how effective policies are more transparent and are more robust. Because some of the modeling done by the government is a black box. People outside of government don't know what's happening, don't know how the models work. But also some of the stuff that happens on the outside, from academics and a little bit from the private sector, they make predictions about the impact of policies, but their models are a black box, right? And now we can't force somebody outside of government to open up their model, but we're saying government needs to encourage this, right? Buildings, we really took the idea, on buildings, we really took the idea of reverse engineering from 2050. If we think the majority of the cities in Canada are going to be relying on district heating systems or heat pumps, why don't we start from today to figure out how we're going to scale to getting there? How do you build the industry of people that know how to install heat pumps and all this sort of stuff? That was sort of point one. Point two was incredible. The federal government puts out building codes, both building codes and a retrofit code, and takes forever to put them out. So the retrofit code, we learned, is the planned update should be ready by 2030. And so forget even just the years involved. By the time you finish that, you're going to have to rewrite it. And so our advice was throw out the entire system and finish a new one by next year, basically, right? And then also push the government proof of concept. The federal government not only owns a lot of buildings in Canada, but rents a lot of space because of all the crown corporations and everything. That there's actually a huge footprint of the federal government, potentially per capita even larger in Canada than the US. And so you can really, through the Green Government Canada strategy, prove a lot. So that's buildings. And then oil and gas. Oil and gas was very unique. The slide is missing. Oil and gas was unique because in 2021 we had another federal election. In the parliamentary system, if you have a minority government, all it takes, elections can be called somewhat at any time by the government being defeated on a vote in parliament. And so we had another election in 2021, and climate policy was central to the campaign. If anybody follows Canadian elections, if you watch the debate, that was like the first subject they talked about, right? And so in the lead up to the election, the Liberal government, of which Justin Trudeau is the leader, the Liberal Party promised that if they were elected, they would put a cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector. And it actually said in their platform that they will ask the Net Zero Advisory Body to ensure reduction levels are ambitious and achievable. Now, during the election campaign, once the writ drops for an election in the parliamentary system, work of the government on that isn't just like keeping the lights on, all has to stop. So we weren't allowed to continue our work. Although we're outside advisors, the staff are paid by the government, right? So we had to take a break and be like, what is this going to mean? And so what it came down to was asking our advisory body for advice on oil and gas, which we're already working on, but specifically not on the numbers, but on what are the principles we should use. Recognize we're not researchers, we're not running models. We shouldn't be the ones giving them the number, but tell us what are the principles to use. And so our advice on this was the number one thing was however you choose the cap and whatever system you use to enforce it, you have to take a whole of economy lens. To think the higher the cap is, the bigger the burden is on all the other sectors of the economy, right? You're basically just making it harder, the transportation sector, the building sectors. They're basically going to mean they're going to have more stringent targets if oil and gas doesn't, right? One, based on evidence from other previous policies, they take too long to implement everything. We need to do this within a year, right? And they have launched the process. Make sure that we're taking workers' rights into account. There's a lot of specifics in here that I didn't want to show you because they might not make sense outside of the Canadian context. And the last point, provide only responsible supports to industry. One of the big concerns is should the government fund efforts to say the carbon capture and sequestration strategy in Alberta? Should the government fund that? Well, we're basically arguing the companies in Canada are flush with money, and we could be investing that money, government money, in all sorts of emission reductions efforts across the country that we know will be effective. Why should the government pay for this in Alberta? And so we're saying they're welcome. The companies are welcome to do this. The government shouldn't pay for it, and which is politically quite challenging. And so, our advice went in to this 2030 emissions reduction plan. They got the advice in advance. So when the emissions reduction plan went out, it actually had in it, our advice document was at the end in an appendix, which was great to see. It was also publicly available. And they took up some of the advice. I wouldn't say to the letter, and there's a number of things that were not taken up, but we have now just received an official response on all of it, which I haven't even had a chance to go through yet, and everything. And the key thing to say about this is that the carbon price is what you hear about, but basically the Canadian government is taken on almost all of the kind of in like every sector have taken on the types of policy recommendations that you hear from academics, right? Where there's an infrastructure bank, there's an accelerator fund, so they're sort of trying to work on innovation and try to provide money to let people invest in net zero solutions. We have a clean electricity clean fuel regulations that just came out, and there's a fund attached to it. There's now ZEV mandates for both light and medium duty vehicles, although the medium duty one is still being worked on, which hence the asterisk. The cap on the oil and gas sector is supposed to come out early next year. Right now, the government has a working paper out with 2 options as to how to do it, and they're looking for advice on that, and we've sent in some advice on it. Working on a clean electricity standard, so 0 emissions by 2035. And right now, again, consultations going on how will this work. Will they allow offsets if it's going to take somebody a while to transition their grid? There's a pledge to reduce methane, and there's carbon capture, utilization, and storage tax credits. So it's different than it's not tied to levels of production, it's tied to spending. So how much you spend on carbon capture and storage. I would say this did not follow our advice, but it was pretty much already in the works, so I think it was too late for us to have much influence on that. And so in terms of evaluations, the most aggressive evaluation of the emissions reduction plan says you're getting close to what's needed. The gap is small for the 2030 target, but this is assuming all of this, plus the other policies in the emissions reduction plan, are actually implemented. Right now, most of it's just on paper. And so it all comes down to, does this get implemented, and is it implemented as it's written on paper? So is it as effective as hoped? So this year, we had the leeway to choose our own lines of inquiry, and we decided that the sectoral approaches were too narrow, and it's too much what the government can already do, and we need to be thinking bigger. And so we're continuing on with governance, but we've added these other 2. One is the net zero energy systems. Really, the fundamental problem is how are we going to get the remaining 20% of the grid off of fossil fuels while also expanding it, given the incredible regulatory complexity in Canada, right? And so we're working on that, and it is complicated. And we're also working on industrial policy. You'd have to know Canada very well, Canadian politics very well to understand this. Even using the terms industrial policy gives everybody the shivers. It's just not a Canadian thing for some reason. And so we're still debating about whether we need to change the title, to be honest. Maybe industrial strategy, but we are trying to identify we basically are settling on a few sectors that we think the government should really specifically plan to try to expand in Canada that are very logical. And this is all based on advice from people across Canada. And actually, in this case, we're consulting well beyond Canada. And so I'll just conclude with a few lessons, both for policy and also just what it's been like to be this random scientist plucked out of his life and asked to do this with his rare spare time. The big thing you notice working with government and having security clearance for environment documents, which doesn't mean a lot, but it means I see stuff before it comes out, is that everyone recognizes that we need transformational change, but the systems are all set up for incremental change. And that is the fundamental challenge to me. It's that we actually have the policy tools, but the system, even if everyone agreed on it, it's so hard to implement anything, right? And so it really comes down to all about implementation, right? The third thing is how important it is when you're thinking long-term to be bold and make exceptions. What happens so often in Canada, we take consultation so seriously at every level of government that every policy proposal just gets beaten down by time it gets to the point of being approved. And an example I may make is that the government has yet to sort of take up with the strength we'd like the proposal of say, listen, you should just go ahead and ban fossil fuel heating devices by a certain year, we're pretty clear on that. They're worried about I think the worry is all the exceptions. Remote communities that rely on diesel, it's going to be hard to do. There's a lot of cities in Canada where frankly in the winter it might be hard to pull this off, right? Without technological innovation, et cetera. And so my argument that I've learned from watching all of this is just put it out now and then create the exceptions afterwards rather than do the opposite, because the opposite means that we never put the policy into place, right? It's not everyone agrees on this, and I wouldn't say a whole advisory body even agrees, but that's sort of what I've been taking away. And the big one for me is figuring out how to future-proof our climate policies and programs, because so much of this could just be canceled if Trudeau loses the next election, right? And so trying to figure out ways, and there are a whole bunch of proposals for how that would make removing the carbon tax difficult, the carbon price difficult, because you'd already have promised it in contracts, basically, with companies. A couple other things. I see in government, there's way too much faith in technical modeling of policy impacts, meaning they get the result and they say, okay, 30% reduction, we've already got that in the can, we don't need to do anything else, right? And so understanding of those uncertainties has been so important, and that's what means why we're pushing so hard on this governance and transparency around modeling and just interpretation of it. And the last two has really been about what it's like to be a scientist there. The biggest thing I've learned is that all the things that we talk about at the university, these sort of grand academic solutions to climate change, they mostly fail because people just don't understand the structural obstacles in government. And we just don't talk to each other enough. It's just like process and structure. Like understanding provincial relations is really like the most important thing in Canada. And the last one has been honestly the most heartwarming, and the best part of this for me is we're all volunteering to do this on the side of our jobs, right? So we have this whole secretariat of people that work for Environment and Climate Change Canada and are seconded, so they are not politically compromised. They have independence, but they are paid by the government. And it is just such a good group of people, right? They are highly skilled and incredibly conscientious. And we've had the chance to talk to people in other ministries, and it's been consistent in every meeting I've been in, right? And it comes down to people in government, in Canada at least, I can't speak for other places, they have a sense of accountability. The minister is going to be upset if I don't get this right. And they have a sense of collective mission, which I think the thing that people maybe don't expect. And all that happens is it just gets buried in the bureaucracy. But I have to say that like every once in a while, I'll be at a government meeting and then on Zoom in the morning, and then I switch over to something at the university in the afternoon, and I'm like, okay, we could learn something from actually how the government works, which is the opposite of what you might expect. And I don't know whether that's unique to Canada, but it's been, as just a taxpayer and a citizen, it's been nice to see. So, and so with that, I'm going to skip this last thing and just say thank you to everybody on the Net Zero Advisory Body. And if you're interested in it, for more, all of our advice and documents and everything are available at nzab2050.ca, and that's me. So thank you. Sure, yeah. In the very back.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could expand on the first point on transition to right now hampered by the fact that everything is structured around closing rather than incremental things rather than drastic things. If you could explain what exactly, if you could give a few examples of how you see this manifesting, and also what would need to happen in order for that to change.
I'm glad you asked that. So an example I'll use, thinking a little bit around the Inflation Reduction Act, for example. So when that was announced, it's an incredibly striking difference between the US and Canada, right? Whereas Canada is like complicated regulations, hundreds of them across the board, slowly being rolled out of time. Whereas the Inflation Reduction Act, to my understanding of it, was throwing a lot of money at something all at once, right? And the criticism in Canada would be, we start the program, but it doesn't get enough money, right? And so, thinking in the building sector, there's programs to help. There's programs out there to help somebody who wants to put a heat pump in their home. So you can get a little bit of money out front, and you can get a loan from the government, right? If you ask a contractor, and this is the value we have as the advisory body, we hear from everybody. If you ask a contractor if they like the program, they say it's terrible. In fact, they advise their customers not to even use it because it's just not enough money, and the policy design is such that the loan doesn't get paid back until the project's done. So if you're the contractor, you basically have to swallow the $40,000 at the beginning because the person who owns the home isn't going to get it early on. And so that's just an example of like a policy design that was thought of getting a few people to put in heat pumps, but not really to get the whole country transitioned over. The whole program's underfunded, And it's just not really designed in the right way. And I think to some degree, I think my understanding of how the EV rebates are supposed to work in the IRA is somewhat learning the lesson from that, is make sure if you go to buy the car, you actually get the rebate when you buy the car, which is not how it works in most of the provincial systems in Canada. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe just a quick follow-up. Is it just a matter of pumping more money into it? I mean, if the government would just put billions into it, or trillions of dollars into it, would that solve the issue, or do you think there are other structural problems around governance or public perception of the subject that are making it, preventing a fast transition?
So from my vantage point, it's a bit of both. So there are cases where, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, for example, is a great concept. It needs 10 times at least the amount of money, right? So it's underfunded. But it's also probably not designed the right way. The requirements they need of how much capital has to be promised by the company for the government to match it, and the process, it's not the process you couldn't, if you gave them 10 times the amount of money, they wouldn't be able to spend it. It's so hard we met with the folks at the infrastructure bank, it's so hard for them to actually get the money out that if you wanted to expand it, you probably need to redesign how it's done. Does that make sense? So it's like a weirdly both? Yeah.
A question about how you view politics and in your advice as an advisory body. So when you're making recommendations, do you think about it through a lens of political economy and what's required to make these policies sustained and durable over time? Or do you think that's not my job, politicians can manage that, I'm supposed to give them the kind of straight recommendations? How do you grapple with that?
It's something we grapple with for sure. Technically, the point of having the advisory body is not to grapple with the political economy in a way. It's just to say, what is it going to take to get there? What are the most realistic pathways? And you consider politics a little bit, but ideally, I think where we can be most helpful is in essence to argue for the long-term planning and sometimes specific ideas that all the smart folks in government probably know is the right way to do it, but because of politics, they're not going to say it. But now we're giving them away. We're saying, well, the advisory body told us we should do this. And so there's no collusion on that. It's just, the current environment minister in Canada was a former Greenpeace activist. Like, it's incredible that he's the environment minister. I don't think we're telling him things sometimes that he hasn't thought of, right? But maybe we have that safe distance to be able to say it. Now, there was a different party in power. I think that relationship would probably be different. I also think I would be fired. So, so I won't get to find out, but yeah.
What is the appointment? How long are you on how does that evolve over time?
It's a good question. So it's up to 3 years, and so I'm appointed for 3 years, but that goes till 2025 because our first year we were appointed before the Act was passed. And then you have to go through the official government appointments process, which is a whole other story. and so I'm on till 2025. Most people are around that, maybe a year shorter. And at that point, we don't know. But we've lost a few members just due to conflict of interests or just other responsibilities. And so people they are actually recruiting right now. So they put out an open call of applications, and the government's sorting through them right now. Yeah, sure. And then I think David had a question. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for your talk, super interesting. About making policies stick, government change. I think for those policies that drivers do great jobs and so on, I think that's easier, right? With the carbon price, I also see this issue. I come from Switzerland, where we have for 10 years now, we have a very high carbon
Yeah.
20 francs. We recycle 2/3 of it, but most people don't know about it. It's through the health insurance, and when you get your annual health insurance offer, there's like it's like thousands of francs, and then there's minus 60 or 100 francs from the recycling of the carbon tax. Yeah. So I was wondering if 70%, as you said, like 70% of the population would make the net benefit from this. What's the plan on this recycling? Because I can't imagine how you design it. It's really in the details, and that can make a big difference whether people like it or not.
Yeah, and this, to be honest, there's people that can answer questions about, there's so many people that can answer a question about how the carbon price works better than I could, to be frank. It is, you do get the money, right? You get a check, basically. I think they need to make a big check and bring it into the house, right? Like, and that's the problem. People don't notice it's been a problem. British Columbia had the same system in advance. We basically kept it since then. And it's somehow, even though it's explicit, it's just somehow not explicit enough so people don't see it. And I think what happens is just the political rhetoric is completely won out. It's become this left-right. It's become this liberal, NDP, and Green. Those are the major parties, the center-left in Canada, versus the Conservatives. And the Conservatives just, particularly right now, we have a fairly, quite right-wing leader of the Conservative Party, says, I'll remove it. And he'll never say price, always say tax. And so I don't think most Canadians, even though they get it, in the mail, realize what's happening. And I don't know how you make it more explicit, I don't know. The hope is that enough years of this, just it'll get harder and harder removed. The court case helps a little bit, but we'll see. I don't know. Yeah. David, you had something.
Simon, could you please elaborate on what you meant by the good work of the civil servants getting swallowed up in the bureaucracy?
I think what I just mean is that procedures are hard. So for example, we have a research budget, and we actually put out a call for proposals on a bunch of very broad themes, helping workers transition, et cetera. People across the country, we've been reviewing them of late. It took a year to get that thing out. The staff, together with myself and people on the research committee, as a researcher, they wanted me on the committee, the staff did an amazing job putting this thing together, but then they just had to weed the thing through, finding some way. The whole advisory body's new. We had to figure out a way, well, what can they use to actually put out a call for proposals? They had to use an existing system, and the existing system ended up delaying it by 9 months, so we're behind, right? That's an easy example, yeah, sure. Yeah.
I'm curious about the carbon capture piece that you're talking about. Just correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like that's a pretty important part of net zero America, the carbon capture industry. And I'm just wondering where Canadians fall on it, how they view it, and why maybe the government would want to support it.
So the government's not against supporting it. They did put in the investment credit. I said our advisory body was saying that I think that in terms of oil sands operators, we don't think the government should pay anything for it. That it should just be they should be supporting it themselves. Writ large, I would say Canada's not, can't talk about everybody, but I think in policy circles, people aren't against carbon capture and utilization and storage, but it depends on the application. So the thing in Canada is it's mostly being talked about for producing oil. And so the worry is CCUS is going to keep the oil industry, let the oil industry expand, the oil sands particularly expand over time, not only impacting emissions, but more cementing it as a part of the economy, making the transition harder. And I don't just mean economically, like on workers. Alberta has had a very boom and bust economy. People are flush with jobs and money, and then they lose them 2 years later. And I think there's some of what we're talking about is, hey, let's break the cycle of this. But there's a major role for CCUS in other industries, and particularly together with natural gas for producing hydrogen. Absolutely there's a role. The worry is that most of the conversation is around just using it to further oil production. I'll point out that over the past few years, the operators in the oil sands are all Canadian companies. All the foreign companies have moved out. So there's 5 major companies and a bunch of smaller ones. The 5 majors are actually working together these days, which is kind of remarkable. And they have a pathway to net zero. They have a whole plan out there. And the main piece of the plan is to build a big pipeline, CO2 pipeline, to a CCUS facility that exists in Saskatchewan and would be expanded effectively. The rest of the proposal, and I'm happy to say this in any form, is just complete hand-waving, with the exception of maybe a little bit of the methane reductions. But even that, the CCUS pipeline, they've already announced, we have $16 billion we're putting in to spend it. And then you read the fine print, pending government support. So the industry keeps promising they're going to do CCUS, but they just keep waiting because they're hoping they're not going to be forced to, and they're hoping somebody else will pay for it. And so there's this quiet stalemate that's been going on for a number of years, is sort of my observation.
Let's take one last question.
Sure.
Well, let's give Simon another.
Thanks, everyone.